Good morning, and thank you all for being here. My name is Adrienne Farewell, and I am the president and CEO of South Carolina ETV and South Carolina Public Radio. And it is an incredible honor to welcome you here with us this morning to mark such a meaningful moment in the state's history. This is not just for South Carolina, this is for the nation. As we prepare to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, we're reminded that anniversaries like this are more than just historical milestones. They are opportunities to reflect, to educate, and to connect. This anniversary, 250 years since the start of the revolution, is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to revisit the founding of our country. It's a chance to look back not only at what happened, but at who made it happen, and especially those whose stories haven't always been told. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, we are standing at the edge of a historic milestone. It's one that invites us to reflect on our shared past and re-examine the stories that shape the foundation of this country. It's a powerful intersection of memory and mission. The founding of this nation was not the work of a few individuals in a distant city. It was a movement that echoed from every corner of this nation, especially the original colonies, right here in South Carolina. And we believe that our state is pivotal to that celebration. The Palmetto State was not only central to the military battles, it was revolutionary. The wind is fighting me, I apologize. But it's also cultural, economic, and it's human narratives here in South Carolina that shaped the nation's early identity. At South Carolina ETV and South Carolina Public Radio, our mission is rooted in education and in public service. It's through the power of storytelling on television, radio, and digital platforms that we're helping South Carolinians understand their past so that we can all together build a better future. That is the gift, but it's also a responsibility of public media. It's our job to preserve, to amplify, and to illuminate the full arc of our shared past, to ensure that South Carolina's voice is not only heard, but understood, that our people, our places, and our contributions and our complexities are part of the national narrative. That's why we are so proud to be partnering with SC250 and the College of Charleston to celebrate today, especially in such a historic and meaningful location as Charleston. We're especially thrilled to welcome the legendary Ken Burns to South Carolina. His name is synonymous with documentary excellence and a deep commitment to telling America's stories in all of its complexity. To have Ken here in person, sharing the vision behind the American Revolution is an extraordinary honor, not just for SCETV, but for our entire state. The American Revolution is more than a retelling of events. It's a reexamination that brings forward new voices, lesser-known perspectives, and the local battles and stories that shaped the course of the war and the country. So without further ado, I will introduce and welcome Ken Burns to the platform.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I want to thank the College of Charleston, its president, also SCETV, Adrienne, for your kind words. In fact, Adrienne, we should take on the road with us, who sums up our project better than anything else. But let me not bury the lead. On November 16th, PBS, SCETV here in South Carolina, will begin broadcasting and streaming our 6-part, 12-hour series on the history of the American Revolution. It is our origin story. As most of you know, we're sort of aiming as a country to celebrate the 250th coming up next year on July 4th, which is the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. But the war actually began 250 years ago last month on April 19th on Lexington Green, where my co-directors, David Schmidt, who's here, and Sarah Botstein, and I had the great privilege of being and commemorating that anniversary. We think that understanding where you've been, particularly this most important of stories, it helps you understand where you are and where you're going. And as Adrienne said, too often we have told only a top-down version of our past, and what we have tried to do in all of our films for the last nearly 50 years of filmmaking in public media is to tell a bottom-up story as well, one that is not an unforgiving revisionism that throws out those top-down figures, but merges the two together, and I think we've done this. I won't work on a more important film in my professional life than this history of the American Revolution. The American Revolution is the most important event in human history since the birth of Christ. Every moment, you know, we like to say that history doesn't repeat itself and quote Mark Twain that it rhymes. We also like to quote the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes, that there's nothing new under the sun. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun, suggesting that human nature doesn't change. Well, it did change, and there was something new under the sun that began here in these 13 former colonies that has been a beacon for the entire world. And our film is an attempt to understand how it started, what its antecedents were, and what took place during the Revolution. We like to refer to Lexington and Concord and then sort of skip to the Declaration and maybe ahead to Yorktown. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. It was 6 long years of terrible, terrible fighting. It would be 8 years before the British were finally leaving the 3 cities they still occupied in Savannah and Charleston and New York City. So it's an 8-year story of how the United States came into being. There's a moment in the Declaration of Independence, a few phrases beyond where Thomas Jefferson's famous second sentence that we hold these truths to be self-evident. Actually, Benjamin Franklin made it self-evident. He wanted it sacred and undeniable, but Franklin suggested self-evident. If there was anything that was not self-evident, is what the rest of that sentence was about. Because up to that point, everyone in human history had been a subject. And right now they were suggesting on paper in ideas a manifestation, a tangible manifestation of the Enlightenment, that people would be citizens, that they would have this extraordinary responsibility of citizenship. And part of what Adrienne was talking about, the responsibility of those in us in public media, is to educate that populace to the complete story. Because our founders felt without the virtue that comes from perpetual education, we would not be worthy of the gift of citizenship. And Jefferson says just a few moments later in the Declaration, all experience has shown that mankind are disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, meaning that we've spent all of human history under the boot of somebody else, under authoritarian rule, under a king or a tyrant or an autocrat, and that we were establishing something different, and that we were granting to people these natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that, by the way, and if every founder were to miraculously arrive here in this beautiful city and talk about it, they did not mean the acquisition of things in a marketplace of products. They meant lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas, which is what this city is about, which is what this college is about, which is what public broadcasting is about and public media is in South Carolina, and what I have spent my entire professional life doing, which is creating films that will be shown on public media for everyone. Today is a school day in the United States in grade school, and we think that thousands of classrooms around the country are showing some or all of many of the films that we've made, which is the greatest reward, that not only do they get broadcast, and most broadcast television is like skywriting, the first breeze and it's gone, but they get used over and over again in the classroom. And that is as important to us as anything. And in fact, we have been working for many, many years on the educational outreach materials for this particular subject, because there's nothing more important, particularly now in our country when we see and perceive so much division. And I maybe will end where Adrienne began, this obligation to tell stories. The novelist Richard Powers said, the best arguments in the world, and you would have to agree that that's all, ladies and gentlemen, we do is argue. The best arguments in the world, Powers said, won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that will do that is a good story. So I have tried to spend the last 50 years in the good story business. I know that SCETV, as represented by Adrienne Farewell today, has been doing that for even longer. And we're blessed to have them. We're very excited tonight to show at the theater right there clips that feature things from the film, but also specifically stuff that I think folks from South Carolina will be interested in. It's not always a pretty story, but it's a complicated and interesting one. For some reason, we have encrusted our revolution with the barnacles of sentimentality and nostalgia. And while we accept the violence of our Civil War, this is an important city for that story, which I have told, and most of the 20th century wars that we have been in, we've accepted the violence of them. But somehow, I think perhaps out of fear that in some ways, if we tell the story of what was a civil war, our Civil War was actually a sectional war, one part of the country against the other, and vice versa, that the Civil War that our revolution was, that somehow it would diminish the great ideas. Those great ideas are not, in fact, diminished. They are enlarged and expanded and made more impressive as they stand in relief with the complicated struggle that began on Lexington Green and ended in Yorktown in October of 1771. And so I'm very grateful to be back in Charleston, a city I love and have spent a lot of time with. I'm happy to be sharing clips in advance and hope that we'll deputize you all in the public media militia to get the word out that the revolution is coming. The revolution is coming. So happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you. So I think one of the reasons why the revolution is at a reserve for us is that they come down to us not in photographs, which are real, and newsreels, which are even realer, but they come down in paintings and drawings, and people are wearing stockings and breeches and have wigs in many cases, and there's a separation. And of course, we have no photographs or newsreels to avail ourselves of in the presentation of this, which has been the case in most of the films, not all of the films that we've worked on. And so we've had to adjust and recalibrate. And so we have spent almost 10 years working on this film. A lot of that is filming reenactors all up and down, not with the idea that can you now reenact the Battle of Long Island or the siege at Charleston, but just to collect hours upon hours of footage in a kind of impressionistic way. You're not seeing faces and wondering what's their real job. You're seeing figures in the dark and lanterns and guns going off and cannon going off and that sort of stuff. And then we've collected as much painting, live cinematography of this beautiful 13 colonies and Canada and other places, and then interviewed scholars and collected for our soundtrack not just the third-person narration written by Jeffrey Ward, a long-standing collaborator, but also literally hundreds of first-person voices that read off camera the diaries, the journals, the reports, the letters from the time. And so you've got people like Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep and Claire Danes and Laura Linney and Liev Schreiber and Sir Kenneth Branagh and Morgan Freeman and Samuel L. Jackson. And I've probably done about a tenth of the voices, all of whom you'd recognize, who help bring on the soundtrack to live. And then you begin to see the way in which we've treated the reenactment footage that we collected not with a specific use as we would the newsreels, as if we went to the National Archives to find out how to illustrate the landing at Omaha Beach on D-Day. And so there's a wonderful interplay between those paintings, which we now treat as photographs, this complicated sound effects and all of the stuff. But you're right, it's been challenging in the most exhilarating way. And we've had the good fortune of being out on the road for many months now, sharing in different communities around the country footage and clips, as we'll do this evening. And the response has just been overwhelmingly stunning. Yes, sir. Well, I think that what our founders understood was that, you know, it's hard to sort of state this. It's sort of counterintuitive, but the best form of government up until July 4th, 1776, or maybe until we established the Constitution, is the British constitutional monarchy. But it's an authoritarian government, and what you have are people who are 3,000 miles away, enjoying both the liberty and the freedom and the isolation that those 3,000 miles provide, and also the burden now that Britain has won the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War, that they need to pay for it, and that we need to pay for it. So we're the least taxed people on earth, and we're suddenly being asked to carry this without representation. And we're also being told we cannot cross the Appalachians into Native American territory and take their land, which is what small farmers and large real estate speculators. So these issues of freedom are born out of a very complicated dynamic and narrative, but they are absolute foes of monarchy. And it's interesting that each one of our 6 episodes is given its title by taking a phrase out of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine arrived half dead, penniless, on our shores in January of 1776 at a time when most people would be looking for some kind of negotiated end to this, maybe not independence, something else. And he just came out and argued at how wrong authoritarian government was, how much it kills the spirit of people, how antithetical it was to the values of the Enlightenment and to biblical values that he also wove into his extraordinary writings. And his writings took off like an accelerant, the historian Stacy Schiff says in our film, in the colonies, and it really changed coming out in January, and it really increased the momentum like a snowball rolling down a hill that is going to move towards first starting a committee that will consider writing a Declaration of Independence and then actually writing it and releasing it to the world. And throughout it, and if you know your history, there's some great poetry at the beginning and at the end. It's mostly a list of 18 complaints against the monarch. That are familiar to anybody. And we like to think, Christopher Brown, another scholar in our film, says that we hear about these third world colonial, anti-colonial movements. We invented it. We're the first anti-colonialists here, and we were rebelling against the arbitrary power and authoritarian aspects of the British government over us. We're still pretty well the least taxed people in the civilized world. You'd be surprised if you went to Europe and saw the extent of the safety net and how much that costs. But it's right. What is so surprising to me is just how much people were willing to risk everything for this concept, a brand new concept of liberty, of freedom, of representation in a real sense. And it started off just being representation for white men of property, free of debt. And even before the revolution was over, it had been extended to most everybody who was doing the fighting and the dying. It's an extraordinary story. And the historian Rick Atkinson says in our film, this is our origin story, and you want to find out what people are willing to die for. And that's what our film is about. what people were willing to die for. By the way, the Join or Die and Don't Tread on Me have very, very interesting and complicated things, and they're used and reused by different. I remember the Don't Tread on Me as being a major banner in the anti-Vietnam War movement in college protests around the country. So each generation rediscovered and reimagines that part of the past that gives it meaning. The Join or Die is Benjamin Franklin's attempt to get 7 of the 13 colonies to adopt a confederation very similar to what the Iroquois Confederacy had done, something called the Haudenosaunee, a democracy that had been functioning in America for hundreds of years. And the sort of origins of that are with native cultures. So it's a pretty wonderful story once you scratch the surface and scrape away some of those barnacles of sentimentality and nostalgia. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, David, what did we learn that we didn't know before? Everything. I mean, when you work on something, I was finishing a film, working with David on a film about the Vietnam War. And in December of 2015, this film was finally broadcast in September of 2017. But in December 2015, we were locking various episodes. And I said the American Revolution is next. We don't pick topics that we know about. We know general knowledge about it. We pick topics that we want to learn about. And so every day of the 9 years and 6 months that we have been working on this have been a revelation. It is so complicated. We think of this as a male enterprise entirely, and it's not. Women are hugely important. We're going to talk about this tonight in a clip, to the resistance movement of keeping it alive in the 1770s before the actual fighting breaks out. Women follow the armies, are very much part of the battlefield scenes, children as well. They're also running businesses back home. Obviously, this is a story about enslaved people, and free blacks in the colonies represent a fifth of the entire population. This is about native cultures that are themselves dozens of independent nations that have their own foreign policy, their own internal struggles, their own complications with other native tribes and with French and British and Spanish powers that have been vying over the prize of North America for centuries. So it's getting to know an intimate detail of a battle. I'd love to sit and put pencils and pens out and tell you how Daniel Morgan handled the Battle of Cowpens, but just north of Spartanburg. But if you come tonight, we'll do it a little bit better than it gets very exciting. You meet some people that you know their names. I'd call them the boldface names. But you understand dimensions to them in new ways. And you meet dozens and scores of people that you've never heard of before that suddenly have real lives and are brought to life by those voices that you meet. You meet James Collins, for example, who's from South Carolina, who's a patriot and joins the cause. And it's, 1/5 of the battlefield deaths took place in South Carolina, even though most of them are in skirmishes and smaller, not gigantic set-piece battles, say, like the Siege of Charleston. It's every day was something new. Well, I think that each state's a little bit worried that they're going to be forgotten, and they don't need to be. South Carolina, I always say that if I had a choice of not being in 2 states, it would be South Carolina and New Jersey, which tells you how important they are and how violent and bloody it was to be in those states during the Revolution at the particular time the Revolution was flowing through the state. The British government was using words in both New Jersey and South Carolina that we used in Vietnam, like pacification, like we've got this province pacified, they would say about New Jersey and about South Carolina, and then it's, oops, we're not pacified. And guess what? We're so not pacified, we think we're going to leave and move on to North Carolina, and then, oops, Virginia, and a port called Yorktown. But it's a spoiler alert. Yes, sir. Yeah, there's certainly, we're going up against one of the two or three great military powers on earth, a little diminished because of the victory in the 7 Years' War. Certainly the greatest navy on earth. The army, not so much. You got to hire some German contract soldiers in order to beef up your army. The odds are 0, sir. But a lot of things happen. The passion of the people involved, weather, which you and I know in advance and nobody knew, the distance between places, and the fact that Houston, or in this case London, is really far away and takes a month or so to get word back and forth, so that you have great armies thinking they're covering territories that are much bigger than they thought they were. And so a lot of things conspire to make this a very complicated thing for the British, and an understanding among this insurrectionary force, as Washington is leading, that even though most of the battles he loses, he's never captured, right? And that's the thing he understands. He can't ultimately lose. The British have to win, and winning becomes increasingly harder and harder for them to do as the course of the war goes on. There are times, though, when you go, finally, we've won at Saratoga, surrender of an entire army, the French are going to help us, and the first two French attempts don't help at all. Charleston falls, and an entire American army, the only time that happens, surrenders here, and it's a huge blow, and at that point you think, whoa, now the British are actually going to pull this out. I mean, good history, David McCullough, the late historian, told me, is sticking around thinking it might not turn out the way you know it did. And so, for example, we introduce in the opening seconds of our second episode a guy who helps capture Fort Ticonderoga named Benedict Arnold. It isn't until 40% of the way through our sixth and last episode that you find out, oops. Up until that point, he's one of Washington's greatest generals. He's fantastic at Quebec. He's even more fantastic. He's the true hero of the Battle of Saratoga, not Gates, who then gets sent down south and screws it all up at Camden. Yes, ma'am. I asked, it's a huge process, and we love the process. Now that it's done, it's your film, and it's not ours. We enjoy this evangelical period where we're out trying to get you guys to watch it. But it's basically, the creative stuff is really getting down to a few different things. I asked Shelby Foote about U.S. Grant in the Civil War, and he said Grant had what you call 4 o'clock in the morning courage. That meant you could wake him up at 4 in the morning and tell him that the enemy had turned his left flank, and he'd be as cool as a cucumber. So we have learned over the course of biting off these big projects, not only how to chew them, but how to have 4 o'clock in the morning courage. Because at the beginning, you do not know what this means. And you would presume that making a film is additive, like building a building, right? It's not, it's subtractive. So I was speaking to this gentleman about the footage that we collected. We have 40 times or 50 times the amount of footage as used, 12 hours. So we're well over 500 hours of material. So it's all what we're, I live in New Hampshire, and we make maple syrup there. And it takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. It's a process of evaporation off, so that we are faced with a gigantic task of trying to whittle down these stories. And what is so wonderful for me is that when the films are done, people say, you didn't do that guy, or you didn't do that battle. And we go, no, ma'am, or no, sir, we didn't, because it's not an encyclopedia. Some of those battles are going to have to stand in for a lot of other battles that take place. Some of the people that we introduce you to, you can't do that. And if it would be an encyclopedia, nobody would watch it. And so we have a very complicated dynamic between the exigencies of storytelling and the need to cover as much of this as we can. And I think, I'm speaking for myself, I hope for David that we are as excited about this project as any that we've worked on, and have that humility that we will not work on a more important project than the story of the American Revolution. So one more, last question. Let me go back and just say that what I said about Mark Twain is supposed to have said history doesn't repeat itself. Of course, no event in history has ever happened twice. It does not repeat itself. He is supposed to have said it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I have never made a film when there aren't so many rhymes going on. And this one, as much as any other film, there is a failed invasion of Canada in this film. Probably, as the historian Joseph Ellis says, the most important military decision that George Washington ever made was to, after initially resisting it for fear that it would put too many troops out of commission, he inoculated the entire Continental Army. So there are debates going on. They're the same thing. You know, we can look at this moment and the invention of the United States as something new in the sun, but everybody goes back to human nature, and it's like reading today's headlines when you deal with any story that we've worked on, and no more so than this one. And that's probably a good place. I hope that everybody has a chance to come tonight to Sotil, and we'll be there sharing a handful of clips from the film totaling about 45 minutes, and have a great conversation with Adrienne and other folks. So thank you.
I want to introduce to the podium Molly Fortune, who is the CEO of SC250. She's one of the partners that we spoke of earlier this morning. And as Molly makes her way to the podium, both Molly and Ken will be available for one-on-one interviews right after the press conference. Molly.
Thank you, Adrienne. I apologize for being late. I got stuck behind a horse, which is not something you can... It is. I was actually immersing myself in the 18th century to prepare for this. I am the CEO of the South Carolina Sesquicentennial Commission. We are a commission that is active in all 46 counties. Our job, to the gentleman in the tie, is to put South Carolina back on the map. It has, for some reason, kind of fallen off a little bit due to something else that happened here. But South Carolina played a pivotal role. And it wasn't just the battles. It wasn't just the men, the Francis Marions, the Thomas Sumters, the Williamsons, the Danger Thompsons, the Nathaniel Greens. It was the women. It was Rebecca Mott, who set her house on fire on Monday. As a matter of fact, that was the 245th anniversary of that. And we've got lots of women here in Charleston who ran the paper. We had the largest Jewish regiment in the nation here in South Carolina. People of all races, colors, everybody participated in South Carolina's role to win American independence. And I like to say, and I know Ken did not include this in the movie, but we just wore Cornwallis out. He needed a place. He needed a place to sun and have a little water in his life. And we just said, why don't you just go on up there? You say it probably a lot more eloquently than I do. But it is our job, and we are in all 46 counties. As I mentioned, we are in the education system, with 68% of Gen Z thinking a dictatorship might be where they want to take the country, and that's the same group that's going to celebrate the 200th anniversary. We, as commissions across the country, have a responsibility to talk openly about the American Revolution. It's complicated. It is very complicated, but it's ours. It is our story, and we live it every day. And it is my pleasure to serve in that capacity. So if I can answer any questions along with Ken, we'd be happy to. But we are so excited also to partner with ETV. They are a great organization, especially in South Carolina. I came from Georgia. South Carolina is rocking the ETV world, not only in their programming, but in their education. And if you have not taken advantage of their website for the educational portion, please do that. It's not just K through 12, it's K through DED. It's about that lifelong learning that happens. So thank you very much. And again, I would have shot the horse, but that would have caused a whole nother problem. But thank you very much for coming, and thank you, ETV and Ken Burns.